Once upon a time, in a faraway universe. Chapter 1. The Uncrowned Queen. Kal sensed the witch hunters coming. The feeling reached out and tapped on her heart with a cold finger. She put her hand over her necklace, a tiny glass vial filled with white sand from solace. Home. When they began hunting her, that was what they took. Home. She reached behind her head and pulled her long hair into a bunch, then clung to the locks for safety with both hands. Was the feeling of premonition or just paranoia? She wasn't sure. The classroom seemed normal. Lillian was reading aloud. A small group that sat in a circle around her. The Giles sisters were writing. The room felt reverent, a temple dedicated to the galaxy's most valuable asset. Tanny worked alone on a contragraph board, distracted enough to have finally put down his seed whistle. The little guy's hair was unkempt, and his pants were held up with a piece of yarn that bunched the waist together in odd places. Kal tried not to think of him as her favourite. She'd found the board in a junk pile and brought it to him. The small boy, hands on the mangled tech, stared intently, like he intended to piece it back together with his mind. Maybe he hoped to somehow discover its origin. The inventors had vanished eons ago. The feeling came again, the cold finger reaching out to touch her. Kal moved to the window, gazing from the 105th floor. Outside, subsolars floated gently by in distant traffic lanes. 2 gentle moons sat quietly in the blue sky, and white clouds drifted. Everything seemed peaceful, calm, except for the menacing silence. Kal often had premonitions, but lately they tended toward paranoia rather than an uncanny gift, and she feared being wrong. If she panicked and gave herself away, it could mean more time hiding in sewers and caves, throwing away the regular life that Benton had helped her create. Or maybe one of her messages to Benton had been intercepted. Maybe they were coming for her specifically, to stop the revolution. No, she had to calm down. No one knew what she was. She knew this logically, and she needed her emotions to follow along. "What's wrong?" asked Darian. Kal forced a smile and looked at the little girl. "Nothing is wrong," Tanny screamed. A musical note sung by terror itself. No respite from the eerie quiet. The others joined, one screech rolling into the next in a chorus of fright. Chairs tipped over. Some children bolted. Others stood in place, surrendering to annihilation, believing this might be the end. Everyone in the room stared at Tanny. The contragraph board had fallen to the floor. The small boy stood alone, in silence, and his eyes were glowing. The cold that touched Kal's heart now gripped her whole body. "I can't see." Tanny's stare projected a white-hot light, obscuring his irises and pupils completely. Tears dripped from the light, past his open mouth. "The light is too bright." If Kal had predicted this, she could have warned the kids to be quiet, to not be afraid, to keep it secret. Too late for that now. Too late for Tanny. The other teachers would have already heard, and would be calling the witch hunters. Kal could let them come for Tanny, could stand by and let them take him, could keep herself safe and anonymous. She didn't pause to consider this option, because what happened to Tanny had once happened to her. Kal dashed across the room. She swooped up Tanny with 2 arms. The song burned hot inside her, adding to her strength as she sprinted from the room, leaving the other startled children behind. Teachers, witnesses, peeked from their classroom doors at the glowing eyes. One of them would call. Strangely, Kal felt embarrassed, not for doing something so illegal, abetting a radiance, but for showing such strength as she carried the boy in a dead sprint down the hall. Her hair was caught between her body and his. As it pulled, she tilted her scalp to relieve the pain. But she didn't have a free hand or time to pause. "Hey, stop screaming. It's going to be okay." She ran on to an open lift and set Tanny on the ground, then punched the activator with the bottom of her fist. The doors closed in a rapid whoosh. She oscillated her head, shaking her hair back into place, and breathed heavily. The lift provided a false safety as it dropped anxiously. They had to get out of the building before... "I can't see!" Tanny stood against the back wall, eyes still glowing. "It's going to be okay." She closed her eyes in a long blink and breathed deeply. What he couldn't see was the transparent back of the lift and the view overlooking the city. Some people in this situation might break the glass and jump to their deaths. Many on her homeworld had done so. She dreaded the possibility, but couldn't erase it from her mind. Why couldn't they leave her alone? That was all she wanted. A little piece of solitude for people like herself and Tanny. Tanny squinted with worry, palms on his face. "What's happening to me? It's so bright." "Your eyes are glowing." Cal felt his emotions through the song, as if his soul were singing a melody she could hear and understand. A requiem. "I'm sorry. I know it's scary. We'll get through this." She knew exactly what it was like. While your eyes glowed, you couldn't see in the normal way. You had to look past it, see beyond normal sight. Until he did that, he'd be blinded. She could teach him how, but it would take time. And the more he fought to see, the longer he'd prolong the glow. She forced her voice to sound calm. "Close your eyes." "Why?" "Because that will help you calm down, which will bring back your vision." And because people would stare when they got off the lift. Because she'd never get him out of safety if they left a trail of observers. But she didn't want to frighten him with these reasons, or let him know that he might never see his home again. He didn't close his eyes, and tears leaked past the brightness. His voice was only a whimper. "Why is this happening?" "You're a radiance." The light inside had been unleashed. He looked blankly upward with his head cocked back. His sandy blonde hair was sticky from sweat, his body overheating. "But why me?" Whatever happened next, the Red Helms would check her background. Her anonymity would vanish, all Benton's work gone to waste. They'd find her fraud and force her back on the run, back into exile. Part of her regretted it already. She wished she could just let Tanny be taken, except for a question Master Jingsu had asked her. "What would you give your life for?" This was it, for Tanny. "I don't know why you or why me. That's just how it is." She squatted, sitting on her heels. Even then she was still taller than him. "Close your eyes, and it will go away. Everything's going to be all right." "Why were they screaming?" His glowing eye sockets looked empty, hollow lights, lifeless, like he wasn't a living creature anymore. He looked like a demon from the other world, a reaper of the dead. She'd seen starsight often enough to get used to it, like a doctor getting used to amputated limbs. But she remembered the horror that struck her the first time. "It's not a scary thing, but the other kids have never seen it before, so it surprised them. What made it happen?" "I was trying to see. I couldn't see the inside." "Of what?" "The contragrav board." It could have happened with anything, yet she still felt guilty when he mentioned the gift she'd brought him. Tanny shook his head, his mouth as hollow as his eyes. I don't know. I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to see a little deeper." "That's good. It's a neat board, huh?" "Why were they afraid?" The ground outside had nearly risen to meet them. "I can teach you to see, to control it, to turn it on and off. But right now, we're almost to the bottom, and I need you to close your eyes when we go out there." His tone moved back to the verge of tears. "Why?" "So nobody notices you. I'll explain once we get away. Keep your eyes closed, and everything will be all right. I promise. Can you do that?" He nodded and squeezed his eyes closed. His eyelids still glowed red, unable to completely hide the light. "Okay, here we go." She picked him up and put his face against her shoulder. The lift gave a deep rumble as it came to a halt. The door slid open and the sounds of people in the lobby flooded in. The school was one floor of a crowded corporate skyscraper. She whispered into his ear, "Keep your eyes closed." She had to get out before the witch hunters arrived. She walked with pretend calm amid the bustling crowd. No one here knew her, or knew what she really was. As she wove through the crowd, she gasped. Tanny jerked, wanting to see what was going on. She pressed his face firmly back down. The patrol flooded in, coming through the door she hoped to leave by. These were regular law enforcement. The troops wore body armor tinted a bloody red with black accents. The Red Helms. Those masked faces were blank, hiding any trace of humanity. Their eyes were cavernous black shapes. With guns pointed at the ground, they pushed through the crowd like hungry carnivores, moving toward the lifts.
"Step aside,"
commanded one of them. His voice through the mask was robotic, a voice that would scare children. Kal had the urge to plow right through and show them what a Radiance could do. But they'd arrived too quickly and entered casually. They must have only been here coincidentally. If that was true, retaliating would only convict herself. She'd been overlooked many times before. The soldiers stopped before reaching the lifts. Their single line morphed into two lines which parted from each other. Using their rifles, they coaxed the crowd to the sides, clearing a path from the door to the lifts. To run this gauntlet was too risky. "What's going on?" an older woman demanded, probably one of the parents. A Red Helm turned and raised his weapon. His mask gave no expression, but sadistic glee came through in the robotic tone.
"You have a special visitor coming."
The woman forcibly crossed the Red Helm line. "I want to see my child." The Red Helm turned the butt of his rifle and cracked it against the woman's collarbone, shoving her violently against the wall.
"Nobody leaves."
The woman groaned and stayed on the ground. Tanny tried to look up. Kal shook her head and covered his face. Her arms were exhausted, and his struggling made it all the harder to hold him. She moved her lips close to his ears. "I'm going to set you down now. Keep your eyes closed and your face against me, okay?" Tanny obediently nodded. She set him down and put her hands on his back, making sure her arms covered the sides of his face. The Red Helms seemed to take no notice of her or Tanny. Alone, she could escape easily. No one knew her or who she was. If she managed to get her heart rate down, she could vanish before anyone could do anything about it. Only, she couldn't surge carrying another person, so her escape would doom Tanny. And the witch hunters would not be merciful just because he was a kid. No one said a word. No one dared. Kal locked eyes with Annika, a co-worker who had the expression of a panicked child. Kal imagined her own face must look impassive, framed between her curving locks. The calm exterior people expected from her, one that didn't match her heart rate. The same lie she lived beneath constantly. She just hoped someone would take care of the other children, would comfort them. Tanny stood patiently facing her, now somewhat calm, and Kal patted his back. Through the entrance walked a long, mean. He looked like a kai-panther with dark purple fur, but with 6 legs instead of 4. And he had unsettling red eyes. Not yellow, like they should be, but red. Many Mina on Sreem walked upright to blend in better with their human counterparts. But this one did not. He crawled like a predator on all 6s, disregarding the way it made him stand out. He wore tribal clothing, made of leather. Maybe this was the special visitor. He seemed to be part of the retinue. Upon seeing him, Kal crinkled her nose against the imagined stench. Mina were from her homeworld, and they were traitors. Benson didn't agree. He trusted them, or some of them at least. Maybe he'd sent this one. She thought she'd seen this very creature in the marketplace, skulking in the background, acting like a guardian or a spy. The mean looked up. His nub-like horns seemed to snap into place perpendicular to her, as his eyes locked onto her, not falling on her by chance, but moving straight to her, as if he'd known, as if he could sense her presence. He gave a discreet wink with one red eye and looked away. She looked away too. She peeked toward the side hallway. Maybe she and Tanny could make their way that direction without upsetting the Redhelms. Maybe, by some miracle, that exit would not be blocked. When she looked back, the mean was staring at her with his animal eyes. He shook his head ever so slightly, warning her not to try it. If he was an ally, why was he with the Redhelms? But if he was an enemy, why had he been discreet? She took a risk and gave the slightest nod. Just then, the crowd gave a collective gasp, but they weren't looking at her. She followed the gazes toward the entrance. A man entered, one she recognized immediately. This was clearly the special visitor. President Malcorn Taiberos, the most powerful man in the galaxy. His gloved cybernetic hand gave him away, as did his fat face. Taiberos wore the same outfit as the soldiers following him, only his armor plates were a charcoal grey and seemed custom-fitted for his unhealthy girth. He carried his helmet under his arm, which exposed his head. His skin was pink, his hair pale. He was the tone of raw meat, a walking, dignified open wound. The hand hanging over the helmet was not covered in armor, but simply wore a black glove. His famous black glove. Beneath it was a cybernetic hand, never once seen by the public. A source of shame, it seemed. But that didn't stop him from famously pounding his gloved hand on pulpits as he campaigned to the ignorant masses. The hand of Taiberos. Behind him stomped a retinue of witch hunters. They wore navy jumpsuits with white mechanical plating over the top, suits that enhanced their abilities. They had batteries and grenades strapped around their waists. Mechanical contraptions hung from their shoulders, chests and arms, making their shapes look more alien than human. Their masks had special lenses that could carefully scan the body temperatures of everyone in the crowd. Alone, her thermogenesis would certainly stand out, a little too hot even for an adult on the move. Tanny's would stand out even more, but they might not notice body heat amongst all the other people. Good thing the mean told her to stay put. Cal's heart raced, equal parts terror and hatred. In her mind, she saw a reporter speaking into a microphone and heard the echo of 4 words. Never heard from again. It had happened to Rothelsfer just a millo ago. Taiberos prowled into the room. Tanny struggled in her arms.
What?
He turned to see. Cal roughly pressed his face into her thigh, covering the sides of his face. Taiberos had an air of indifference, as if perfectly immune to social pressures, which showed on his smug expression. She both envied and despised that quality. He meandered, looking at faces one by one, slowly getting closer to her and Tanny. You know who I am. The room was silent in reply. Cal kept her eyes unfocused, barely stealing glances. Taiberos spoke with a calming tone, one that suggested he only barely kept the insanity at bay. They used to call me the witch hunter. Do you know why? Cal instinctively sensed that vial of sand hanging from her neck, as if the thought of home would steady her. Taiberos, walking toward her, suddenly stopped, directly in front of her, as if he knew. But how could he have known without his helmet on? Her breath caught in her throat. She looked down shyly at Tanny's sandy head and forced herself to breathe. Even air seemed vile, like food to a retching stomach. She thought of the forbidden melody, hoping its notes could calm her down. Taiberos gave her a pleasant smile. It wasn't the first time some creep noticed her flowing hair and shapely figure. People between them stepped aside, exposing her, exposing Tanny. One of the white-clad witch-hunters dropped a long mechanical box. It gouged the floor with a loud bang. The unexpected noise startled her, which sent a jolt through her body, and for the smallest moment her guard dropped. Tanny's curiosity peeked just a little too far into the open, exposing his glowing eyes. They saw him. People screamed, the crowd exploded chaotically, and Taiberos grinned. Taiberos snapped forward with the speed of a predator. It would have made sense for him to go for the culprit, Tanny. If he had, Kal might have gotten the upper hand. But his cybernetic hand locked instinctively against Kal's throat and jaw, slamming her head into the wall with a crack that made her ears ring. Stars zoomed past, and for a moment life became blurry. With his cybernetic grip locked around her neck, he grabbed her long hair with his other hand, twisting her to the ground, right in front of everyone. Tanny lunged with a growl, eyes glowing. He hacked wildly at the armoured private parts, a direct assault on the president of the pan-galactic socialist democracy. Taiberos let go and swept violently with his cybernetic hand, batting Tanny away like an insect. With a groan, the boy went flying, the metal fingers having pierced his skin, leaving bloody holes. Kal didn't think about her next decision, didn't decide at all. She simply reacted. Her skin burned with heat, her core ignited like a furnace. The fire inside flowed out through her eyes. They knew her now. "Get her!" Taiberos's mechanical fingers swiped at her neck. With a snarl of white teeth, she shoved at her assailant with more power than a human her size should have been able to muster. Her hands never made contact, yet Taiberos's head jerked backward, and he stumbled in his heavy suit onto his knees. Her hands clawed the air, pointing at Taiberos. Though she was a few arms' lengths away, she could feel his neck between her fingers. She threw her hands downward. Taiberos toppled. His head smacked the ground. His expression remained eerily passive as his fingers scraped at the skin of his own neck, feeling for something to pull away, but there was nothing. He was being throttled by a ghost. Keeping her grip flexed, fingers still pointed at Taiberos, Kal looked for Tanny with her glowing eyes. One of the white-clad witch-hunters levelled a stun gun at her. The snub-nosed weapon coughed a low, rumbling boom, like a single beat smashed against a terrible drum. The air rippled in a tight cone as the blast zoomed across the room. When it hit, her muscles locked, and she collapsed like a mannequin. The shot's collateral range caught several people near her, and they crumpled too. The witch-hunters rushed her. Her muscles were knotted, clenched painfully, and she couldn't move. As the hands gripped her body, touching her all over, she felt some small satisfaction knowing her grip still clung to Taiberos's throat. It lasted only a moment longer, though, until she lost her sense of his position. Her eyes searched the edges of the room. If only Tanny could have gotten away. Taiberos stood, his hand rubbing his neck. "Well, shit. She's valuable." He said it so matter-of-factly, not surprised at all. She hated how he always seemed so composed. The red helms piled on top, crushing her and pulling her hair. She saw one last window of light through the mass of bodies, and then she completely surrendered. As her muscles relaxed, she felt an unusual calm, and her heart slowed its beat. Maybe while paralyzed, she still had a chance to surge, disappearing from their grasp and reappearing a short distance away. Taiberos was a step ahead. "Get her on the exhaust, quick. I'll bet she can surge." She closed her glowing eyes, as if in prayer, but she was too late. Through her lashes, she saw an alien paw gripping a mask, moving toward her face to suffocate her. It was the red-eyed mean. She should have trusted her instinct. She struggled, but they pinned her head against the ground. From that angle, she could finally see Tanny. He was lying on the floor not far away. She'd lied. He wasn't going to be okay. He was bleeding, unmoving, and the light of his eyes had gone out. The witch hunters pressed the mask over her mouth and nose, forcing her to breathe in the exhaust. Almost immediately, her hazel eyes closed, though she wished they wouldn't. Darkness crept in from the corners, and she lost awareness of her body altogether. For a moment, she saw Tanny and believed he was okay. She wanted to ask what he'd seen when he was looking into the contragraph board. She wondered if she'd ever finished the lesson she'd started. A white monster clawed into her biceps and pinched the nerves next to her bones. Her shadow rushed past her from one side to the other, time and again, at the speed of her heart, which still beat much too fast. She was no longer herself. She wasn't any self. And then the sky peeled back, exposing her brain. If they could touch that, she'd lost everything. She was just a thing, an object, a slave. And Taiberos could have his way with her. She felt his hands on her naked skin. Her heart raced, exhausting her, and yet she couldn't fall asleep, so maybe waking was the answer. She fought for consciousness, but sleep wafted like a vapour around her, and she couldn't help but inhale it. At least she was still breathing, and she could open her eyes if she wanted. She could. She knew she could. She felt cold, grey dust beneath her fingers, powdery dust. She felt cold, and completely alone. Alone for cycles and cycles. Only she couldn't see the place where she'd arrived, not without opening her eyes. She didn't know how long it took, but somehow she finally managed to wake. Dim light poured in, seeping from overhead. Grey walls stood in front of her, all around her, moving slowly or hardly at all. As she became aware, she realized they'd stripped her. She was naked, and she couldn't even remember when or how it had happened. She did remember Tanny's face against the lobby floor, and his body lying completely still, skull bleeding, eyes open, staring without any light. She pulled her knees up close and wrapped her arms around them, trying to cover herself so the grey walls wouldn't see her. Even alone in this room, she felt exposed, violated, and sore. The very sanctity of her body had been forcibly breached. It felt gross, disgusting. She wanted to vomit. Fighting to feel fully awake, she squinted. She put a hand to her neck, wanting to feel her necklace, that small bit of home. It was gone too, taken from her, just like her real home, and replaced by a collar locked tight around her throat, one that fed a toxin into her system at regular intervals. More nausea hit as she realized something else was missing. She reached up to touch her hair and felt skin. Her hair was gone. Gone. Completely gone. Her naked shoulders curled forward as she put her desperate hands over her skull, bowing her face down into her knees. She'd never felt so vulnerable, never touched this close to her own brain. She turned to the side as her body heaved. She spewed rancid liquid. It splashed on the floor, and the odour floated into the air. Taiberos had done this. He'd made it illegal to be her, to be Tanny. Her elbows pulled together to shield her further. She hadn't protected Tanny. She couldn't even protect herself. The mechanical collar poisoned her again, shooting the exhaust into her neck. Immediately the dreadful sleep began to grip her. Still, she fought to stay in this nightmare reality. She rocked forward and back, a gentle rhythm of calm waters against a painful shoreline. She would have felt anger or grief, but these were lost behind stronger emotions. Never before had she felt so frail, so mortal, so naked, and so very, very afraid. Soon the collar's dose would steal her consciousness. She saw Tanny's eyes, staring blankly without light. Her own eyes squeezed shut, and tears dropped, leaving dark splotches on the concrete floor. Chapter 2. Cupcake.
Knack, why are you in here?
Asked Cupcake. I'm avoiding the clients. Knack sat in an easy chair aboard his ship, the Sanctum. The scuffed leather chair had seen better cycles. Cupcake had told him not to haul it aboard, but he never listened. One of its arms had a dark, brownish-red stain on it. The recliner was completely out of place in these sterile surroundings. The floor was a metal grating that clanked when he walked on it. The room was a circle, not large, but large for so small a ship. At the room's centre stood the bulky cylinder of the surge drive, which extended high overhead and dropped below the grated floor. The surge drive was directly between his chair and the door. He'd done that on purpose. Access panels and lights lined the circular walls. Everything in the room was metal, sharp and freezing cold. Yet he loved it in here. Which was good, because if he didn't like metal sharp and freezing cold, then he might not like her either. Her technical name was CPC-4K3, but he just called her Cupcake.
You've barely slept for 2 isocrons in the last 20.
Cupcake's voice came from a tiny cube, barely as wide as Knack's little finger, clinging magnetically to the cylindrical surge drive. Well, nearly a cube, anyway. Each of her lines were slightly rounded, each corner just larger than 90 degrees. He once said she was like a cube who'd put on a little weight. She didn't like that description at all. Yep, he said.
You keep ignoring my warnings about building sleep debt.
Humans who spent too much time awake could start to hallucinate without even realizing it. Yet even on this important topic, it was like persuading a mountain to move.
PSD standards are 10 isocrons every 30.
Fuck the PSD. In one hand he gripped a dread mask. It was a dark helmet, and the front had a face. The upper half had big, round, shadowless goggles for eyes, and the lower half was a grinning mouth with tusk-like fangs curling out. In truth, Cupcake couldn't see any of this. After all, she was just a tiny cube with no eyes. Through the ship's phantom link, she could use all its peripherals, which meant she could see very clearly outside the ship. But inside the ship, she could only listen and speculate. Luckily, she had a big imagination. Still, she hated when he just sat there in silence. Hated it. But if she brought that up, he'd tell her to work on the anchor riddle. And she could, of course. She even wanted to work on it, but she wanted to talk to someone a little more. She decided to risk breaking the silence.
What are you thinking about?
I don't know. Sometimes communicating with him seemed like navigating a maze.
Just give it a try,
she said, with a snark in her tone. Maybe a touch of flirtiness, in what she considered a sexy voice. One of the few options she had for displaying any personality.
Please?
It's hunger.
The oleoges on the starboard side are ripe.
Not my stomach. More like my soul.
What does a soul eat?
If I knew that, I'd eat it.
I'm telling you, you're sleep deprived.
Her high-toned, slightly raspy voice matched her size.
Just go to sleep.
I need to talk to the clients.
Why?
Find out more about this girl we're rescuing. Can't get them to tell me more than what I've read on the Freenet.
Then what are you doing in here?
Carp! When he said her name in that tone, she stopped immediately. She knew when to push him and when to stop. She aimed her magnets till, with a clack, she snapped downward one body length, still clinging to the metal wall, but now with a different face. It took a moment to redirect her magnets, and then she tilted forward once again. Another snap. This was basically her form of walking. Not difficult, just tedious, rolling her cubic self along the walls. From here to the cockpit would take 988 clicks. There was an easier way, but Knack wouldn't listen. He pretended to, and then he'd say it was safer if she was limited to the ship's metal. Like he thought she wouldn't be loyal, just because other CP units had been unstable. He was wrong, though. She imagined Knack lying there with his eyes closed as she clacked her way down the surge drive shaft. Persuading him seemed as impossible as solving the anchor problem. And yet she kept trying. If she could just budge him a little.
I wish I had someone to talk to while you were gone.
Knack leaned his chair back and put up his feet. You can talk to diagnostics.
He's a slave processor.
So?
He's not interesting.
Who do you want to talk to then?
Everyone.
That's because you don't know everyone like I do. If you knew them, you wouldn't want to talk to them.
Yes, I would.
She'd once been a completely white cube, but her worn edges and corners now exposed her metal colour. Then Knack had drawn a face on each of her 6 surfaces. 6 ways for her to show her emotions. Happy, sad, shocked, angry, excited, and neutral. After he'd put her back down and told her what they were, she'd immediately clicked to the angry face side and said,
I can't believe you drew on me.
Graffiti was not funny. He'd drawn on the outside of the ship too, but the ship couldn't talk. She would never admit this aloud, but the faces he'd drawn turned out to be useful once she got over the affront. She'd just rolled till the appropriate side faced out. A pretty genius little feature. She stopped descending when she was directly in front of him, right at eye level. She rolled one last click to the side, showing her face with a hand-drawn grin.
I get lonely, okay? When there's nothing to do.
We've been through this. She could tell he hadn't opened his eyes to look at her.
But Knack,
The voice had a bit of a whine.
I could talk to the clients for you.
He sat the recliner back up, put his feet on the floor and leaned forward. Cupcake, I cannot emphasize this enough. You can't talk to strangers. I mean it. No strangers. If you do, you force me to choose between you and the sanctum. Don't make me do that, okay? She clicked one face over, revealing her crying face. He sighed, leaned back, and rested an arm over his eyes. Something like that, anyway. After a short silence, he said, You're lucky I didn't get a slave processor.
Then I wouldn't be able to think.
And you wouldn't talk so much.
But Knack, you don't believe in slavery. So are you glad you got me?
Still deciding.
How long is that going to take?
At least another %.
That's so long.
You better be good then. The chair squeaked as he shifted in it, probably into a more nap-like position. The steady hum of the surge reactor became the only sound. Infraspace swirled outside the ship as they travelled to a place called Tor to rescue a woman from prison. The mysterious woman who Cupcake wanted to know more about.
Okay, go talk.
Then she could at least listen. But he didn't budge. As the engine hummed, she thought and thought, wanting so badly to say more, to communicate, which she might have still gotten away with, if she said the right thing. If she didn't nag, but nagging was really all she had left right now. Maybe she could work on the Anchor riddle for a bit. Captain Anchor became the maneuver's namesake because of how many lives he took. Knack had told her the story. To travel across large distances in a skycraft like the Sanctum, you had to get away from other gravitational sources. Otherwise, the 3-body problem had hashes too complex to calculate. Usually, this just meant your craft couldn't go anywhere, but Anchor somehow forced it. Instead of his ship surging to its destination like it was supposed to, it created a whirlpool in space-time that sucked in a whole fleet. None of them ever came out the other side. Maybe Anchor did it on accident. Hard to imagine someone wanting to lose everything like that. It had been done since, but only a handful of times, and no one who'd solved the puzzle stuck around to explain why or how they did it. Cupcake only liked the puzzle from a theoretical standpoint. It was a fun challenge. Plus, maybe if she solved it, she could keep anyone else from doing it to the Sanctum. Knack encouraged her to work on it, but if she acted too interested, he'd shut down the conversation with, "Don't get any ideas." At least the puzzle kept her occupied during the silences. In theory, any bloody wing could do it. Cupcake thought she could probably do it if the Sanctum were sitting still for about 10% of a lifetime. But no way Knack would spend 1/10 of his life just sitting there. Besides, Anchor hadn't done it that way. He'd somehow found a method that wouldn't overtax the surge drive. Some quicker route through the maze of data. Cupcake crunched the numbers over and over, trying to find that faster pathway. Sometimes it felt frustrating to reach dead end after dead end, especially when she'd rather be talking with someone. Anyone, really. Of course, Only one person was an option. Only one person was ever an option, and he was napping. Still, she almost... But then she didn't, because she wanted to be good, for Knack. The reactor kept humming. And then she... But she didn't. This wasn't the best time. Though that was the problem. It was never a good time. He was always grumpy. Then the words just came out, basically on their own.
Hey, after the Charloak job, you said I could get repainted.
The chair squeaked as he squirmed and groaned. I can't believe you don't want your faces.
We could get them professionally done.
You don't like my drawing?
Well, I might feel comfortable if a professional did it.
Ouch, cop.
I'm sorry, Knack, but you don't practice drawing very often. That's all. Or you could get me a body like you promised.
I never said that.
Yes, you did. On 435.95.1701, you said maybe I could get a body sometime.
I said maybe.
Well, maybe, yes?
I'm not sure you really want a body.
All right, give me your body, and you can stay here on the ship.
You'd change your mind on the first cycle. And bodies are always needing maintenance and repairs and fuel. They're a hassle.
Maintenance is what I'm best at. Besides, PKBs are getting pretty advanced.
PKBs?
Physiological kinesthetic bioforms.
I know what they are, cop. He sat back up. How do you know about them? Her tone slowed, her pitch raised, as she began to tread more lightly.
The Coralanes were talking about them while they were aboard.
I've got to be more careful with your mics.
PKBs work almost like real bodies. You could get me one of those.
They're expensive.
We can afford it. Trust me.
We?
It's a team effort.
I seem to remember you telling me not to take the bosun job.
Well, it was dangerous.
She imagined him furrowing his brow, as if struggling to heft a distant memory. In fact, I seem to recall you doing that on just about every job we've been on.
Aha! You just said we.
All right, we. You're helpful. But I can take care of the books.
Only you don't. I was keeping them in order.
Having the books in order is only going to cause trouble.
I shouldn't have brought it up. I just wanted you to know we could afford a body. In fact, we could easily afford 2 of the Biopack X.9s.
We don't need 2.
You know a cyborg body would be stronger than yours at peak performance.
I don't want one.
Why not?
She mentally waded through the silence.
Knack, why not?
I just don't.
But give me a reason.
He sighed. The Mapak say a person's soul is fused into his atoms. If I became a cyborg, I'd lose a portion of that soul. He was certainly thinking of Taiberos.
You've got to spend your half on something.
My half?
Yes.
Okay, Cupcake. Remember, I'm the captain. He stood up from his leather recliner and groaned as he stretched, head tilted back, his body becoming the shape of a T, holding the mask on one side. She knew what he looked like. His powerful blue eyes were those of an exiled prince, doomed to wander as an outcast. With broad shoulders, he stood nearly a head taller than the average man, built to shape the galaxy rather than speak about it. She loved that about him, and she envied it. She imagined him curled forward in a somber mood, deflated, taking the dread mask in both hands and staring deeply into its wicked eyes and menacing smile, as if battling it, will against will. Maybe he was talking to the mask when he said, "Time to figure out how exactly we're going to rescue this girl."
Do you think you're going to fall in love with her?
I told you, we're not talking about my love life. And no, I won't fall in love with her.
Why not?
She imagined a shrug. It's a job. He started for the door.
Do you think I could ever love?
He turned halfway back toward Cupcake. I guess that's up to you.
What do you mean?
He shook his head. You just choose to love someone.
How?
I think your AE might be broken.
What? Why?
You shouldn't be showing this much emotion.
I think yours is broken. Just tell me.
When you love someone, you put their needs over your own. You sacrifice for them. So you can choose to sacrifice or you can choose not to. That choice is love.
That's what I'd do for you, Nak.
I guess so.
I've sacrificed getting a body so that we can keep the sanctum safe.
That's right, he said.
So I guess I do love you.
He cleared his throat and stepped toward the door, his boots clinking against the metal floor.
Nak, do you love anyone?
He pulled on his dread mask, transforming his aspect into a monster, and reached for the door controls. It changed his voice into a deeper, more menacing tone.
Just one person.
Chapter 3. Sky Reacher.
The mysterious man in the mask approaches.
As Nak climbed the aft ladder and came down the hallway, he straightened his leather jacket. He looked good wearing it. His body temperature stayed too high for layers, except that this jacket had an internal coolant system. It was black, except for the right sleeve, which had a wide red stripe running down the length of it, from neck to wrist. He punched harder with that arm too. Ribbons of green plants lined the walls of the sanctum, growing from a trough at his elbow height, and illuminated by constant white radiation. As he passed, he said to the man who'd just spoken,
You're jealous, Dre.
The PSD had made it illegal to wear masks, unless you needed one to breathe. A stupid law Nak liked breaking.
Of course,
said Dre in his deep voice.
Those are the shadowless goggles. Any kid would be.
Nak turned his dread mask to look directly at Dre. His voice was darker and more sinister through the vox.
What the hell happened to you?
Dre had on some strange makeup that in combination with his beard made him unrecognizable from his former persona as Lord Admiral. His deep voice was still him, though.
Although we hope to keep our masks on, this is a precaution. Otherwise, my face is quite recognizable.
He was also wearing a full suit of red helm armor. The helmet sat in his lap.
So is this one. Benton did that to you?
He's good, isn't he?
He sure knows how to f*** up someone's face.
Nak continued toward the cockpit. Dre wasn't quite as big as Nak, but almost. And although he was older by a good 20%, he'd aged well, thanks to a secret from Orban. His red infantry armor was a huge step down from his former rank. He'd let his grey hair grow out long and wild, in complete contradiction to his former career. His beard was trimmed, his demeanour kind, yet stern, and he acted like he cared, which made Nak feel grateful, confused and wary all at once. Dre's dossier said he started in the PSD as an enlisted pilot. Over time, he advanced through the ranks of officers, becoming a decorated figure, and then the youngest Lord Admiral in history. Then he defected, which made him infamous. The dossier had no details as to why, and the wild rumours flew. Nak admired the daring it must have taken to betray his own countrymen. Dre took a seat next to Nak, and together they stared out the windscreen at the mesmerizing pattern created by the storm of infraspace. Each sequel of travel brought them closer to their objective, a prison and a mysterious woman. The pattern outside was a tunnel of writhing light. Nak had once seen something that reminded him of it. He'd gotten beaten up pretty bad on Feith. Almost lost the sanctum then, too. While cleaning himself up, his blood dripped into the basin, and for half a sequel it looked exactly like infraspace. The way the red liquid partly congealed, drawing together to form strings, while also spreading outward, getting thinner and turning the water pink. Infraspace was like that, but over and over. Like they were sailing into that drop of blood, but instead of just red, many colours formed the strange swirling network. We'd watched it more than almost anyone, yet the wonder never seemed to wear off. Nak tapped a button which changed the readout on the holograph.
I can't believe how clear the image is,
said Dre. Nak shrugged. That was Photos tech for you.
I can't imagine what it must be like having one of these, said Dre. Who do you think you are?
Nak's dark voice came through the mask.
A damn good pilot, or you wouldn't have hired me.
Dre wasn't Knack's friend. Knack didn't have friends. Too much of a liability. He sort of had Lolo, who wanted to be more than friends, but he wouldn't let her. Dre was close to being an actual friend, an almost friend. That meant a lot in Knack's paradigm. Plus, they were both from Terran Prime. Of course, he had Cup, but he felt embarrassed to think of her as more than hardware. Still, nice to talk to her sometimes. Knack tapped 3 buttons on the instrument panel, verifying the data he already knew.
Hey, Skyreacher, said Dre. How long until we touch Dan?
He was talking to Knack, who glanced over his shoulder. The clients had never seen Knack's face or gotten his real name.
Half an ISO.
The wings jittered, and Grey looked questioningly at the tentacles writhing outside.
So how does your Skycraft work?
It didn't seem like a question any serious person would ask.
What?
Dre responded in all seriousness.
You mean the surge drive?
Yes,
It's alien technology.
I know that. Are you telling me you haven't learned anything about it since you got it?
Nope.
Come on. Dre seemed to have a more casual tone around Knack than elsewhere. That also said something about their almost friendship.
It breaks the rules of physics, at least the ones we know.
Go on.
Let's say I flew in a long arc curving from Tor to Sybil. Then I turned around and flew back across the same space, but with less of an arc. I'd get back faster, right?
Yes, not because you flew faster. A straighter trajectory means less distance.
Exactly. Most ships can sail in a straight line. That's the fastest they can go. Curve of 0. But the Sanctum can sail in negative arcs.
Negative arcs?
Knack said confidently,
Yeah, shorter than straight lines.
Photos technology seemed far beyond mortal comprehension. For example, according to natural law, if you travelled immensely fast, you'd experience a short amount of time while the rest of the galaxy experienced a long time. So the traveller might experience a few sequels while a whole lifetime passed for everyone standing still. But for some reason, flying in a bloody wing reversed that. The traveller experienced several isochrons, while almost no time passed for others. A reversal of time dilation, directly contradicting nature's laws. Or else the whole galaxy was doing the travelling while the ship stood still. Whatever was going on, it made no sense. Still, Knack liked to pretend he got it.
But that's impossible,
said Dre.
Only in 4 dimensions.
And how did you learn this?
I just made it up.
Dre shook his head, unsure whether Knack had been joking all along. And that was right where Knack wanted him. Dre swiped a hand over his grey beard.
You have a computer aboard?
Cup's grin popped into Knack's mind, but he just glanced over at Dre and didn't reply. He didn't like to talk about the hardware.
Where do you keep it? Pressed Dre.
Put away,
said Knack.
I don't think you ever told me what line of work you were in before you got your hands on the Sanctum.
I navigated a spice freighter at Skalcurian.
And now, you do odd jobs?
Mostly data runs. They're good money, but less exciting than the sort of thing you guys hired me for.
Dre gave no reply, so they sat in silence, listening to the hum of the surge drive. It played one note that pulsed in a high-pitched warble, so quickly that it almost seemed stable. The sound of steady airflow accompanied, like the ship was constantly exhaling mechanical breath. Knack checked the stats again. Everything in order. Dre cleared his throat.
You gonna tell me how you got it this time?
Knack turned his mask toward Dre, and its exposed teeth made a threatening snarl.
My ship? No.
And apparently I didn't talk you out of your mask either.
Can't afford the luxury of trusting people.
Letting Dre be an almost friend was already pushing it.
Maybe you should consider giving it up.
The Sanctum? Hell no. Are you kidding?
Knack's ship blasted through the empty cavern of space. The edges of the wings ruffled up and down, in the shape of a solid wave or a shimmering angel. Its sheen cloaked it in black as night.
I don't envy you, said Dre.
Why not?
You have one of the galaxy's most prized possessions, and what it's doing to you is clear.
Giving me freedom.
The opposite. Having this skycraft isolates you from everyone, and isolation is exactly what a prison is.
Fortresses isolate too, you know.
Not from loved ones.
You're trying to talk me down before you start making offers.
Dre had a gentleness to his voice, a calm, an earnestness too.
I'm saying this as a friend.
In his head, Knack corrected the phrase to almost friend.
You are invited aboard as a client, not a guest lecturer.
His dread mask peered forward through the windscreen. He knew the history of the Bloody Wings, and he knew the consequences of his actions. Knack learned the story from his dad. The last time hearing it stood out in particular, for obvious reasons. The tall buildings hid all but a narrow slice of the sky. Little Knack had been lying on his back next to his dad on a stretchy frod tarp that smelled of grease and Atmos fuel, looking up at that slice of starry night on Terran Prime during one of the long summers. "Dad, tell me about Captain Skyreach's first flight and Ion Zero." "You gotta pick one." "Can't you do the whole thing?" "You need to go to bed." "Just tell it fast." The history enchanted Knack. It felt like the stuff of legends, a thing of reverence. It also happened to be true. A long, long time ago, when the Photos Galaxy was very young. "How long again?" "Over 19 ions ago. 19 whole human lifetimes." "That's a lot." "Hard to imagine, huh? On a planet named Rhyme, 2 nations went to war. The Toshi humans against the Mina, with their 6 legs, horns and sharp teeth." "And you've seen one in real life?" "Yes, I have." "Awesome." "The Mina massacred the humans." "And it was the bloodiest battle ever." "Who's telling this story?" "I don't know." "Yes, it was bloody. Gruesome, I imagine. Probably would have made you sick to your stomach to see it. They killed them all, down to the last man. And that last man was just a boy." Little Knack grinned, anticipating. With his family dead, along with everyone he knew, the boy ran for his life and learned to survive alone in the wilderness. "And learned how to make a fire." "I'm not telling that part. Then, one cycle, he stumbled on an abandoned alien colony, with crumbling ruins and broken temples hidden beneath the creeping jungle. No one was around, but whoever had once lived there left behind a skycraft." "And Skyreacher probably found the bones of a dead pilot inside." "Yes, probably." "A Photos?" "I like to think so, but no one knows." "I wish we did." Knack remembered how the tarp had stretched beneath his elbow. It took smarts, and maybe a miracle for the boy to get the ship running. You got to work really hard to figure out something like that all on your own. When he did, the Elizan came alive, and then he sailed it. With the Atmos drive, he shot up into the sky all alone, with the thrusters shaking and pressing at his back. He grit his teeth like this, because he could hardly take the G-force. Then, with the Zentisal drive, he crossed space for the first time till he reached Solace, Rhyme's sister. The boy found the remains of the civilization who'd made his ship. Technology that we still can't understand. But the aliens themselves had vanished. "I wish we could find out where." "You need to lie down." "Thanks, Knack." As the boy grew up, he made a new home there on Solace, but he felt pretty lonely, having a planet all to himself, so he returned to Rhyme and made friends with some Mina outlaws and brought them back with him. "And he wrestled the chief." "Maybe I'll tell that one next time." "Okay." On Solace, the Mina helped him build a village, a new home, and the boy grew old with his new friends. "You're skipping all the good stuff." "It's bedtime." "But you didn't tell the first interstellar flight yet." "Well, I keep getting interrupted." Little Knack pursed his lips. As an old man, the boy finally figured out how to use the surge drive. He took one Mina buddy with him and left to another solar system. That was probably pretty shocking too, to see the swirl of infraspace for the first time,
with no one to warn you what it would be like.
I can't wait till I get to go into Stella.
When you get a little bigger.
And that was Ion Zero?
Yep, that was sort of like the beginning of history. That moment made him famous forever, and he became known as Captain Jether's Skyreacher.
I wish I had that ship.
So do I.
Then what?
That's the end.
No, it's not.
Well, as you know, the colony never heard from Captain Skyreacher again. We don't even know where he was buried. But after 2 ions, the Elizan returned to Solace without him, full of pirates from Terran Prime. The pirates had better weapons.
Rifles!
Yep, rifles. The pirates conquered the Mina of Solace and stole every Photos artifact they could find. The humans of Terran Prime then copied as much of the tech as they could. They made Atmos drives to fly through their own air and Zentisol drives to explore their own solar system.
Then they found the surge gates.
And people began travelling from star to star. The connected galaxy. Fight for control. Blah, blah, blah. I don't want to tell all that. It's time for bed.
You skipped the bloody Armada.
Why do you want me to tell it if you know it all?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, when the pirates looted Solace, they unearthed a bunch more ships that were the sisters of the Elizan.
And they could go into Stella without a surge gate.
Then what happened? Little Knack jumped into telling the story with all his enthusiasm.
People fought over the ships, killing and blood, so they called it the bloody Armada. I don't see why they can't just make more.
Knack's dad squinted. No one has figured out how to make a surge drive or a surge gate.
But why not?
I don't know.
Can't they just look at one and build the exact same thing?
Well, it's complicated. It would be like you trying to build a contragraph. Just because you can see it doesn't mean you can recreate it.
I'll bet I could when I'm a little older.
I know you could. But for now, we're stuck with what the Photos left behind.
I wish I could figure it out. Then everyone could have one.
Maybe you will when you grow up.
I want to hear the part where he fights the Kai Panther.
Time to go to sleep, Knack. Whenever Knack smelled grease and Atmos fuel, he thought of that night. It wasn't just another story, though. It was the last story, and the last time he'd seen his dad alive. The whirling storm of infraspace calmed and calmed until it was nothing but a dark blanket pricked with stars. Knack grinned beneath the dread mask. As the sanctum came back into normal space, any nearby skycraft would have detected no electromagnetic disturbances of any kind. One moment housed empty space. The next carried the ship steadily along, whispering across the blackness. He didn't even need to burn Zentisol fuel to create his initial momentum. A thing of beauty. Few bloody wing pilots knew how to do that. Because these drives were so valuable, governments monopolized most of them, and the rest were controlled by big corporates. That divided the flying among large crews and bogged it down with standard procedures, preventing anyone from getting good at the fine details. Few in the galaxy had clocked as many ISOs at this either, making him one of a kind, just like his ship. The space surrounding this solar system was filled with dust, like a common atmospheric cloud, a vast vapour frozen in time. The rays of the nearby sun reflected off it, in strands of electric purples and smeared blues, though they were hard to see without starsight. He pressed the internal comms button and leaned forward.
We're on approach, landing in half an ISO.
He had a mirror on his dashboard for keeping a subtle eye on anyone behind him. He saw Dre in it, sitting patiently, silently. Knack glanced over his shoulder.
How'd you get roped into this mission?
After my military career ended, I spent 2% of my life incarcerated.
Dre seemed a little too kind and a little too calm to match the profile of an inmate.
I'm somewhat of an expert on Building 13 now.
Knack raised his eyebrows and nodded. He'd been caught by the witch hunters once himself, but he managed to escape before getting his own reluctant tour of Building 13.
I can't imagine what's driving you to go back. Seems a little risky, doesn't it?
It's a long story.
I won't pry.
No, I'll tell you.
Dre gave a wry grin.
Seeing as how you're my friend.
We hardly know each other.
And yet I'm probably one of the people you trust the most.
Knack's mask stared blankly at the comment.
This could also be one of the last conversations I ever have, said Dre.
You wouldn't go in there if you didn't think you'd make it back out.
No, you wouldn't.
Knack nodded. Fair point. The truth was, on the Feeth job, Dre had gone beyond the contract, beyond his own self-interest, and risked his life to save Knack's. That strange fact made no sense. Knack kept looking for a reason, a moment when Dre would suddenly demand repayment. But it hadn't yet come, as if Dre had done it simply for the sake of helping a person who needed help. That strange fact also defined their relationship. Knack wanted to reassure Dre, tell him he wouldn't die, that it wasn't his last chance to get something off his chest. But this mission had extremely high stakes, and one small hitch could be fatal, or worse. And while Knack prided himself on keeping cool under pressure, marching into Building 13 required guts at another level. Guts he admired. Or maybe it was just plain stupid. Must have been some girl in there. Dre said the next sentence with an uncanny calm.
I helped create the witch hunters.
Out of respect, Knack's mask withheld any response. Dre went on.
When I served the PSD, I hunted down RADIANCES. I captured them, took their freedoms in the name of safety, while calling it my duty. I did that for percents, till the laws I'd enforced on others were enforced on me, on my family. I tried to save them, but I failed. And my actions landed me here on tour as a prisoner.
He bowed his head, not with a shameful expression, more as if out of reverence. Knack was surprised but couldn't show it on his mask, and didn't know how else to express it. Again, he said nothing.
After escaping Building 13, I became an exile, on the run from nearly everyone, a bit like you. I was tormented by what I'd done. Without my family, I had no future. I wanted to die, till almost magically I found Master Jingsu. He taught me to calm my mind, and I began to see. I realized my purpose was to make amends for my crimes.
So you're going to end the witch hunters?
I want more than that. I want to stop the thing that created them. I want to put an end to people's fear and complacency.
Big goals.
I would give anything to change what I helped create.
Dre's demeanour shifted again, battling for calm.
We've spent ions squabbling over the same old things. We have great potential, but we need guidance to reach it. We're children in need of a parent to show us the way.
And who would that be?
A new government.
You don't like our government, huh?
Dre shook his head in an emphatic no.
Any particular reason?
Dre sighed.
We've all seen the government do some good. For example, it protects us from the Grizzly.
That's about the only one I'll concede.
And yet it overtaxes its citizens, censors the truth, starts unnecessary wars, and kidnaps innocent radiances. The government hurts people on the outskirts the most, like Benton, or the prisoners in Building 13. But it's not hurting the majority enough personally, so they remain complacent. They turn a blind eye to atrocities like the ones I committed. To most people, it's a dull pain they can ignore, even while Solace is being oppressed and Kalhette's life is being shredded to pieces.
As he continued, his tone rose in passion.
People feel safe, but it's a lie. They think the PSD's wrongs are justified, that the good it does outweighs the bad. That's not acceptable, though. If the government will treat one citizen that way, they'll treat any citizen that way. That's the truth. And while the populace does nothing, the government continually grabs more power.
with that bastard Taiberos at the helm.
Who the majority elected.
Doesn't make it right.
Dre took a deep breath and seemed to calm back down. Of course not. No one is safe either. If we let this go on, soon it will be too late. The PSD will become too powerful to stop, and then it will turn on the populace, just like it did to me.
Knack inhaled quietly through his mask.
Maybe people are trying to lie low, staying out of it for their own self-preservation.
Seemed like a good tactic.
You're right. The galaxy is filled with children, people who can barely take care of themselves. I understand. Fear drives them, rather than some higher cause, and that hurts other people just like I did when I heard those radiances.
Dre paused, leaving his words to linger across the silence and the hum of the Zentisal drive. Knack wanted to defend himself, but that would have been a confession. Instead, he chose the noble route.
Well, at the time, you thought you were doing the right thing.
It doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong, and look at what I created.
So you're planning a revolution?
If that's what it takes. I want to give the galaxy a better government than what they have.
If you don't die down there, are you going to regret telling me all this?
No, I trust you.
Dre stared with a pervasive calm, looking so deeply it was like he could see through the dread mask, although that was impossible, even with starsight.
Not sure Benton would want you telling me.
Benton doesn't know you like I do.
Knack laughed. His mask looked toward the black space where the tiny dot of a red planet grew in size.
I hope you're not waiting for me to take my turn at a last confession. I'm not risking my life in the Strand, remember?
I don't think...
Skyreacher! Skyreacher! Benton's shout came from down the hallway. Not a demanding shout, just an overzealous one, considering Knack was in the cockpit. He felt glad it had interrupted his turn, though.
I'm right here.
He swiveled his chair and watched as two figures came down the hall, a human and a mean. If Knack weren't wearing a dread mask, he might have greeted them with a grin. Instead, he touched a finger to his masked eyebrow and gave them a lazy salute. First was Benton Zylander, the man who'd charted the mission. On Dre's referral, Knack met Benton in a dark cantina on Skalcurian. That was how this had all started. The low lights had seemed to enhance the sounds of tinkling drinks and murmuring patrons. Knack liked to start these interviews by letting his mask do a little silent intimidation, while he sized up the potential client. "You must be Skyreacher," said the client. Benton was around 5% of a lifetime older than Knack. He was the pristine sort, sandy hair always recently cut, always combed, and a beard perfectly trimmed to match. His narrow face had a straight nose that ended abruptly, as if measured with a straight edge. His eyebrows slanted upward in the middle, giving him a lasting expression of sincerity. His ears were about the only thing you could criticize on his perfectly regal face, and even that was a bit of a stretch. Knack leaned forward under the warm table lights.
You're a Jean? You don't look like a monk to me.
That's because Jani aren't monks. Benton took it well, keeping his cool on nearly every topic, including Knack's exorbitant price. He came across as exceptionally competent, and he seemed like a nice guy, maybe a little too nice. That didn't stop Knack from probing till he found a weak point.
So this woman, she's your daughter?
Benton became rigid, like he expected a Grezzik to jump out of the conversation at any time. No.
Girlfriend?
Benton squinted at that comment, like he was hiding a cringe on the inside. Can we keep this professional? Of course, Knack could be professional, when he wanted to, but he needed to get an emotional read.
Fine. This woman is of marginal importance to you.
Benton put his hand over his mouth, as if the phrase had been so far from true he could barely keep his protest from spilling out. After one round of drinks, Knack knew two things. This man could be trusted, and he'd pay a lot of money. Knack took the job. And now the two of them sat together in the cockpit of the Sanctum, with Benton wearing the armour of a red helm.
"Here, you take that one,"
said Benton in his distinguished tone, pointing to an open seat. The fourth member of their outfit wasn't human. Though Knack had seen plenty of Mina in his life, they still held some intrigue from his childhood. To him, they were creatures straight out of myth. This one's name was Link Adine. He looked like a kai-panther, but with 6 legs instead of 4. His feral head was covered in short, dark fur, coloured like a deep purple wine, and his yellow eyes shone in beautiful complement. From the profile view, his cranium curved forward into a snout, like a wilder cat's. From the front, his ears drooped to the side like wings, sloping toward his jawline. No horns yet. His large eyes sat wide on his face and formed an obtuse triangle with his dark, wet nose. And they conveyed the keenness of a soul. His mouth curved back and down above a strong jaw. His lips seemed to have been bunched together with needle and thread. Crude leather armour covered his body. He curled awkwardly into the chair designed for humans and folded his upper, shorter arms across his chest. A strangely human gesture, while his lower ones rested on the arms of the chair. The fingers on his lower paws reached the floor, splayed out in an inhuman way, and one claw twitched, tapping against the metal. When Knack was a kid, he wondered what having that extra pair of arms would be like. A thought that crossed his mind again. Would definitely help in a dogfight. When Link had first boarded the Sanctum, he pointed at the plants growing in the hallway and said,
"You cultivate life. That shows reverence."
He spoke with a voice slightly higher pitched than you might expect. A voice that was small, humble, timid in tone, but bold in its clarity. Quietly bold.
"I eat them,"
Knack replied.
"One can honour what is exchanged for his own life."
Link's tone was smooth as a hot drink, a surprisingly mild voice for such a large creature. He had an accent, too, which added a dash of alien sour to the soothing liquid, a voice familiar and foreign. Knack always wanted to hear a little more. Once Link sat, the 4 companions watched the red sphere growing in front of them. Sybil was a massive planet, with low density, much too hot to survive on, with nothing to stand on if you tried. They were just close enough to see her moons too, one of which was the place they'd meet their death or glory. Benton leaned forward and stared out the ship's glass screen.
"Wow, I'm not sure I've ever seen a planet spinning so fast."
Knack dimmed the cabin lights, making the vista outside all the more impressive, shining brightly by contrast.
"Tor's just as bad. Wait till you're on the surface and see the shadows."
He navigated toward Tor, a giant moon with a dark terrestrial surface and an orange breathable atmosphere. Some strange collisions must have birthed her and put her on her present course. She spun so quickly that you'd notice a decrease in weight if you moved from the poles to the equator. If she rotated faster, the velocity would tear her apart. Yet somehow, Sybil gave her just enough stability and warmth to be a viable home to biological life. One of the planets pulsed, with a jarring waveform that turned red. "What was that?" asked Benton.
"It's picking up seismic activity on the surface, not far from our landing site."
"A bomb, maybe,"
said the mean.
"No, it's not a war,"
said Dre.
"Massive quakes happen often here. It's unstable."
Benton faced Link.
"My intel was a little vague on this point. The explosions might not be natural, possibly a byproduct of one of their research projects."
Knack felt something strange on approach. A hunch, really, but maybe stronger. A feeling of destiny, maybe. Something grand in scope. Almost epic.
like it was hanging in the sky overhead, waiting to fall. Not that he believed in that sort of thing. Maybe his gut did, though. He let out a lazy sigh as he clipped on 2 shoulder belts. His tone revealed the grin beneath his mask.
Okay, boys, the fun's about to start.